Solving a trinomial. After watching this video, I will be able to solve a quadratic equation. So first we want to remember what a quadratic is, and it's basically a polynomial of degree 2. Because my biggest exponent here is the number 2, this is a degree 2 polynomial, or better yet called a quadratic. Because this is set up as an equation, meaning equals to 0, we have to do two things. First, we have to factor this down using our methods of factoring, and then we're actually going to find what the value of x is, meaning we're going to find what the solution to this equation is. Because we're dealing with a quadratic, we should have two possible answers for x. So first, I am just going to ignore this equals 0 part, and I am just going to focus on the x squared minus 12x plus 36. I will factor this just like I've been doing in my previous lesson videos. So I am going to set up my magic x. My leading coefficient times my constant would be 1 times 36, which is just 36, and my b term is negative 12. I am going to list factors of 36, so that'll be 1 times 36, 2 times 18, 3 times 12, 4. Does 4 work? 4 does work. 4 times 9, 6 times 6. And I see one that might work. 6 might work. Now I just need to see if that's accurate. So 6 times 6 gives me positive 36. That works. 6 plus 6 does not give me negative 12. So what happens if I make these 6's negative? Negative 6 times negative 6 still gives me 36, so that's good. Negative 6 plus negative 6 gives me negative 12. So this works. I'm going to rewrite my expression. This negative 12x now becomes negative 6x and negative 6x, positive 36. I am going to factor by grouping, so I'm going to factor out the GCF of an x. X minus 6 is left over. Now I'm going to factor out a negative 6. So 36 divided by negative 6 gives me negative 6 is left over. So now I have the common factor of x minus 6. And what do I have left over? Well, I have an x and I have a minus 6. So now now that I factored this down, I'm going to bring down the equation part. And I'm going to say equals to 0. And because there's something called the zero product property, this means that when you have factors that equal 0, one of these factors has to be 0. So I am going to set up two equations. I am going to say x minus 6 is equal to 0. And then I'm going to say x minus 6 again is equal to 0. And the only reason I'm setting up two of the same equations is because in this specific example, I ended up with two factors that were the same. This might not always happen. So I'm going to solve for x. X plus 6. So we're going to add 6 on both sides. X is equal to positive 6. Add 6. X is equal to 6. So in this case, my answer ended up being 6. There are two of them. This is known as a double root, but technically it's the same number, so it's just the same thing. So in order to solve quadratics, we have to factor down our quadratic, our polynomial. Once we have factors, we will use the zero product property to say, hey, this is a factor, this is also a factor, it has to equal 0, so each of the things independently equals 0 and we can solve for x. So our x equals a number is known as the solution to the quadratic or as a root or 0. So basically what's happening visually when we graph it in a few lesson videos that are coming up is that our x equals number is actually known as the root or the zero, and it's where your graph crosses the x in axis, or known as your x-intercept. So these roots or zeros are really important because it's what gives you the actual answer to your quadratic. And you can have different answers. So you can have two different solutions or two different numbers. You can have one solution, which is exactly what just happened. Even though we had two equations, it ended up being the same thing. Or you can have no real solution. And the good news is, for the purposes of Algebra 1, you don't even have to worry about that. But once you get to Algebra 2, you'll go more in depth into what is the solution if it's no real solution. So now you try. Solve this quadratic equation. Okay, so the very first thing is to factor out your polynomial. So my magic x, 1 times negative 20 is negative 20. My b term is just positive 1. I am going to list factors of 20. So 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 3 does not work, 4 and 5, and I see that 4 and 5 might work. So let me just write that down and see. So it has to be negative 20, so that means one of the numbers has to be negative. I need to decide which number that is. I want it to be a positive one, so I'm going to see what happens if I make 4 negative. Negative 4 times positive 5 gives me negative 20. Negative 4 plus 5 gives me positive 1, so that's going to work. I'm going to rewrite my polynomial. So x squared positive 5a negative 4a negative 20 stays the same. Factor by grouping. I have an a left over. So a plus 5. I'm going to factor out a negative 4. A plus 5. So I am left with GCF of a plus 5 and a minus 4. I bring down my equals 0, and now I solve. So I have a plus 5 equals 0, a minus 4 equals 0. Inverse operation, so a is equal to negative 5. Inverse operation, a is equal to 4. So my correct answers would be 4 and negative 5, which would be D.